I was pushed off a cliff during a family trip. I should have died, but I woke up in an abandoned cabin. The man who found me was our former gardener, fired by my wife right after my daughter vanished. Then he opened a door. A little girl stepped out. She looked at me and whispered, "Daddy." My 5-year-old daughter had been missing for 2 years. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now let's dive into today's story. For 2 years, James Mercer believed his 5-year-old daughter was missing. For 2 years, he also believed his wife was suffering beside him. He was wrong about both. Mary disappeared when she was 3. The Mercers were living in Ashford, Vermont, in a white house on Ridgeline Road with a wide backyard and a fence that James had painted himself the summer before. It was the kind of street where people waved from their driveways and nothing ever happened. Jean told the police that Mary had been playing in the backyard while she started dinner. She said she went upstairs for a few minutes. She said she came back down and the yard was empty. No broken window, no forced door, no footprint in the flower bed, no neighbor who saw a stranger's car at the curb. James spent the first year searching. He printed posters at a copy shop that stayed open until midnight, and the owner stopped charging him after the 3rd week. He taped them to light poles until his fingers cracked in the cold. He called hospitals in 3 states and learned to say his daughter's height and weight without his voice breaking. He walked through parks in the rain, checking the tree line, calling her name until his throat gave out. He talked to every parent at Mary's preschool. He learned their names and their work schedules. He learned which of them crossed the street when they saw him coming, because they didn't know what to say anymore. He barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of the backyard. Always the backyard. The grass. The plastic slide. The gate. Jean was different in front of people. At the community center, she cried on camera. She held a photograph of Mary against her chest and told a reporter she would never stop looking. She thanked the search volunteers by name. She stood at the front of the church on the 6-month mark and said her daughter was still out there, and half the room cried with her. James believed all of it. Inside the house, it was quieter. Jean stopped saying Mary's name. She stopped going into the bedroom at the end of the hall. When James left the door open, she closed it. When he put a photograph on the kitchen counter, it was in a drawer by morning. He told himself grief looked different on everybody. He told himself she was protecting herself. He told himself a lot of things. Then one night in February, he asked her again. The heat kicked on in the vents. She was standing at the sink with her back to him, scrubbing a pan that was already clean. "Can I ask you something about that afternoon?" The water kept running. "James, I just want to walk through it one more time." She shut the tap off. The silence after it was worse than the noise. "We've gone over this 100 times. I know. 100 times." She set the pan down harder than she needed to. "The police. The detectives. Your brother. The woman from the news. You. I'm not the police. No." She turned around. Her hands were red from the hot water. "You're worse. You keep going. You never stop." He stayed where he was. "How long were you upstairs? You think I don't want her back?" "That isn't what I said. It's what you mean." Her chin lifted. Her eyes were wet, but the wet came fast, the way it does when it's been waiting. "You're making me feel guilty for something I didn't do. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you know what it's like to lose a child and then be treated like a suspect in your own kitchen?" James looked at her for a long moment. He was tired. That was the truth of it. He was so tired that the fight felt heavier than the question. "I'm sorry," he said. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he stood there with his hands at his sides before he lifted them and held her back. Her hair smelled like the shampoo she'd used since the first year they were married. He closed his eyes. "We only have each other now," she said into his shoulder. He nodded. He stopped asking. For a while. Later, he would go back to that night in his mind more than any other. Not because of what she said, because of what she did after. She went upstairs and slept 8 hours straight. He sat at the kitchen table until the windows went gray. Before Mary disappeared, there was a gardener. Michael Rourke was 57 years old and had worked around the property for almost 6 years. He came Tuesdays and Fridays in a green pickup with a dented tailgate and a toolbox bolted to the bed. He drank his coffee black out of a steel thermos and never once asked to come inside to use the bathroom, which James always thought said something about a man. Michael wasn't just someone who cut the grass. He knew the routine. He knew Mary came home from preschool at 11:40. He knew Jean opened the kitchen window every morning and the upstairs hall window on warm days. He knew James worked late on Thursdays because that was when the truck deliveries came in at the store. He knew where the spare key was, and in 6 years he never used it once without asking. Mary loved him. She used to follow him around the yard with a plastic watering can, dumping it into the same hydrangea over and over until the soil turned to soup. Michael never told her to stop. He'd just say, "That one's had enough, sweetheart. Try her sister," and point at the next bush, and Mary would march over like she'd been given a job at the bank. After Mary disappeared, Michael stayed on for several weeks. He came on his days and worked without music and swept the walk twice. Once, James found him standing at the edge of the backyard, near the gate, just looking at the grass. Then Jean fired him. James found out on a Wednesday, when he noticed the hedges hadn't been touched. "Where's Michael?" Jean didn't look up from the mail. "I let him go." "You did what?" "Why?" "He'd become unreliable. Late. Sloppy." She flipped an envelope over. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." "What did he do?" "Nothing serious." She set the mail down. "I just don't want him around anymore." "That's not a reason." "It's my reason." Her voice went flat in a way he'd started hearing more often. "I'm in that house alone all day, James. I get to decide who walks past my windows." He didn't have an answer for that. It sounded almost fair if you didn't turn it over. He called Michael that evening to apologize. Michael didn't seem surprised. He said he'd come by for his tools. The last time James saw him, it was late afternoon, and the light was thin and orange over the driveway. Michael was loading a hedge trimmer into the bed of the truck. He set it down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and turned around. He looked at James for a long time, long enough that it stopped being comfortable. "You need something, Michael?" Michael's jaw moved like he was chewing on a decision. "James," he said, "if you ever start wondering whether everything you've been told is true, call me." The wind moved through the maple at the end of the drive. "What's that supposed to mean?" Michael reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out. James took it. A phone number, written in pencil, in the careful block letters of a man who didn't write much. "You already have my number," James said. "Now you have it twice." "Michael." But the older man was already climbing into the cab. The door groaned shut. He rolled the window down halfway and rested his arm on it. "You're a good father," Michael said. "I want you to remember somebody told you that." Then he backed out of the driveway and drove away, and James stood there holding a piece of paper with a phone number he already had. He decided grief was making the old man strange. Everyone was strange that year. The mailman couldn't look at him. His own brother started every phone call with an apology. He put the paper in the junk drawer, under the batteries and the takeout menus. He never called. He didn't know that Michael would spend the next year of his life trying to find him. 6 months after Mary disappeared, Jean started talking about leaving. She began carefully, the way she began most things. She would mention a house she saw online. She would say she couldn't drive past the preschool without pulling over. She would say the neighbors looked at her like a widow. She wasn't entirely wrong, and that was the trap. James couldn't drive past the preschool either. The sight of the low blue fence made his hands go numb on the wheel. At the grocery store, people saw him coming down the aisle and turned into another one. And the house. God, the house. Mary's room stayed exactly the way it was. Jean wanted to pack it. James wouldn't let her. So the door stayed shut and the room stayed frozen, and every night he walked past it on the way to bed, and every night something in his chest pulled sideways. "We're dying here," Jean said one night. "Slowly. Both of us. If we leave, and she comes back, don't." Her voice cracked, right on cue. "Don't do that to me. The police need to know where to find us. The police have our phone numbers. The police have a file. It isn't 1970. She sat down on the arm of the couch. "James, I can't hear that gate anymore. Every time the wind moves it, I stop breathing. Do you understand that? I stand in that kitchen, and I stop breathing." He understood it. That was the thing. Every word she said was something he felt. He said yes. They sold the house in 11 days to a young couple who didn't ask why, and took less than it was worth. Jean handled the paperwork because James couldn't sit in a room while a stranger talked about square footage. They moved to a small community several hours away, a place with one traffic light and a hardware store that closed at 4. Jean picked it. She said she wanted quiet. She also suggested he change his phone number. She said reporters had been calling. He hadn't heard from a reporter in months, but he was so tired that he let her handle it, and she came back from town with 2 new phones and a story about a package deal. They didn't leave a forwarding address with the neighbors. Jean said she couldn't stand the pity cards. They didn't join the church in the new town. They didn't tell anyone what had happened, and in a town like that, not telling anyone meant nobody asked. Within a year, almost every thread connecting James Mercer to Ashford, Vermont had been cut. He thought the move might help them heal. It didn't. They ate dinner in front of the television. They stopped touching. Jean started taking long drives on Saturdays, and when he asked where she went, she said around, and he didn't push because pushing had a cost and he'd stopped being able to pay it. He kept a folder in the closet with everything. Case numbers. Detective names. The flyer. What he didn't know was that during that same year, in the same country, a 57-year-old man with a dented truck was looking for him. Michael went back to Ridgeline Road and found strangers living in the house. He asked the neighbors. They said the Mercers had moved, and no, they didn't know where, and one of them thought maybe out west. He called the number he had. It was disconnected. He called the store where James used to work and learned it had been sold. He drove to 2 towns on a rumor and came home with nothing. Somewhere in the middle of that year, Michael learned something else. He learned that Mary Mercer was probably still alive. After that, he was looking for 2 people instead of 1. He found the little girl. He still couldn't find her father. By the 2nd anniversary, the marriage was a set of habits with nothing behind them. They slept in the same bed and never touched. They spoke about the car and the price of heating oil. Jean had gotten thin in a way people complimented her for. James had gotten quiet in a way nobody complimented at all. He'd gone back through the folder in the closet, and something in the timeline kept catching the way a splinter catches on cloth. Jean told the police she was upstairs for a few minutes. In the first interview, she said 5. In the second, she said 15. He had both transcripts. He'd read them so many times the paper had gone soft. 15 minutes is a long time. 15 minutes is long enough to drive somewhere. He hadn't said a word about it to her. He'd learned that much. Then, in late September, Jean suggested a trip. Somewhere with mountains, she said. Somewhere neither of us has been. He looked at her over his coffee. Why now? Because I'm losing you. For a second, she sounded like the woman he married. 2 weeks. I'm not asking you to be happy. I'm asking you to stand next to me somewhere that isn't this house. They flew into Seattle and drove west, past mill towns and long stretches of wet green, until the road narrowed and the trees closed in overhead. They stayed in a rented cabin near Lake Crescent, at the edge of the Olympic Peninsula, where the water sat in a bowl of mountains and went a blue so deep it looked painted on. The air smelled like cedar and cold stone. In the mornings, mist lay flat on the lake until 9, and then lifted all at once, like a sheet being pulled off furniture. And Jean relaxed. That was the part James would never forget. Not the fall. The relaxing. She slept in. She laughed at a bad joke the man at the general store made about the rain. On the second morning, he came out of the shower and found her on the deck with her feet up on the railing, eyes closed, face turned to the sun, and something in his stomach went cold. She hadn't looked like that in 2 years. She hadn't looked like that since before. He stood in the doorway with a towel around his neck and watched his wife enjoy herself. And for the first time, he let himself think the thought all the way to the end. She isn't grieving. She's finished with something. That afternoon, they hiked the trail above the lake. It was a good path, wide in most places, packed dirt and root, with a low wooden rail at the overlooks and nothing at all in between. The lake sat 200 feet below, flat and dark, with the pale shape of the drop-off visible under the surface where the shelf fell away. There were tourists on the trail, a family with a dog, 2 women with hiking poles. They had passed them all 20 minutes back, and the voices behind them had faded into birds and wind. They came around a bend where the trail hugged the rock and the ground fell off on the left, and Jean stopped walking. James went 3 steps further before he realized. You okay? She was looking at the water. Her arms were folded. The wind moved her hair across her mouth, and she didn't push it away. We can't keep doing this, she said. Doing what? Pretending. He turned fully around. Somewhere below, a bird cut across the face of the lake. What are you talking about? She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. You should have let Mary go. Everything in him went still. What did you say? She looked away fast at the trees at the trail behind them, and he saw it. He actually saw the exact second she understood she'd said too much out loud. He stepped closer. Jean, what do you know? Nothing. Look at me. I said nothing. She shook her head. You've been asking the wrong questions. For 2 years. The wrong questions, over and over, and you never once. What question should I be asking? The wind came up off the lake. It was colder than it had been all day. Jean. His voice had changed. He could hear it himself. What question should I be asking? She didn't answer. She stepped toward him instead. He thought she was going to touch his face. That was the thing he could never explain afterward, not to the detectives, not to his own attorney, not to himself at 3 a.m. He thought his wife was coming to put her hand on his cheek. Her palms hit his chest. There was no wind-up, no shout, no rage. It was a quiet, practical shove, the way you'd move a cart out of an aisle. His heel came down on the edge of the trail and found nothing. He went backward. His arms flew out. His fingers scraped rock and caught a root, a real root, thick as his wrist, and for 1 full second he hung there with his chest against the cliff face and his boots swinging in open air. He looked up. Jean was standing above him on the trail. Her hair was moving. Her hands were down at her sides. She was looking straight at him. She didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees and reach. She didn't shout for the family with the dog, who were maybe 400 feet back and would have heard her. She watched, and in that second, with the whole world reduced to 10 fingers and a root, James Mercer understood every single thing about the last 2 years of his life. Jean, the root gave. He fell. Rock came up at him. Something hit his ribs and turned him. Branches tore at his arms. Sky, then dirt, then sky. A sound like a door slamming inside his own head. Then there was nothing at all. The first thing was the smell of wood smoke. The second was pain. James came up out of the dark slowly, the way a man comes up out of deep water, and pain met him at every level. His ribs, his shoulder, a hot line above his left eyebrow that pulsed with his heartbeat. His mouth tasted like copper and dirt. He was on his back on a narrow bed. The ceiling was bare wood, dark with age, with a lantern hanging from a nail. Rain ticked against a window somewhere to his right. He tried to sit up. Don't move. He knew the voice before his eyes found the face. It came from a part of his memory that smelled like cut grass and gasoline. A man was sitting in a chair beside the bed. Gray hair, cut short, a face like weather, hands folded between his knees, big and scarred across the knuckles. Michael Rourke nodded once. There you are. James stared at him. Nothing in his head would line up. The trail, the route, Jean's hands, how his throat closed. He tried again. How are you here? I found you. Michael reached over and picked up a cup from a small table. He held it while James drank. The water was cold and tasted like iron. Down below the trail, about 60 feet off the path, hung up in a stand of cedar. Whole slopes like a net down there. It caught you. You were on the trail. I was. Why were you on the trail? Michael set the cup down. I'll get to it. James turned his head. The room came into focus a piece at a time. A wood stove in the corner with the door cracked, and orange light showing through. A kettle. A coat on a hook. Boots by the door drying. Small cabin. Old. Clean. How long have I been here? About a day. A day. His heart kicked. He tried to push himself up on his elbow, and his ribs put him right back down. I need a hospital. You do. And you're going to get one. Michael's voice didn't rise. Doctor from town came out last night. Friend of mine. He wrapped you and stitched your head and said if you weren't awake by tonight, we were carrying you out whether the road washed or not. The road. Slide came down yesterday morning. 6 miles of it. They'll have it open by tomorrow. James lay back and breathed. Each breath was a small argument with his ribs. Then he remembered. My wife. He said it flatly, like a man reading a word off a page. Where's my wife? Michael didn't answer. That was answer enough to make the hair stand up on James's arms. The older man got up instead. He walked across the room, slow, and James followed him with his eyes, and that was when he saw the door. It was a small door at the back of the cabin, a bedroom door by the size of it. There was a padlock on the outside. James's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. What's in there? Michael stopped with his hand on the frame. Michael. James got up on his elbow, and this time he stayed there, ribs or no ribs. What is in that room? The old man's shoulders rose and fell. When he turned around, his eyes were wet, and James had never once in 6 years seen that face do anything at all. I've been carrying this for a year, Michael said. I don't know how to set it down gentle. He took a key out of his shirt pocket. His hands were shaking. It took him 3 tries to get it into the lock. The padlock came open. He pushed the door. A little girl was standing just inside. She had a blanket around her shoulders and an oversized gray sweater that hung past her hands. Her hair was longer than he remembered, past her shoulders now, and darker. She was taller. Her face had lost the roundness of 3 and found the shape of 5. But it was her mouth. It was his mother's mouth, the same as the day she was born, and James Mercer felt his whole life come apart and put itself back together in the space of 1 second. She looked scared. She was holding the door frame with one hand. Then she saw his face. She went very still. Her eyes moved over him. Her lips started to tremble. Daddy. Something broke open in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't make a sound. He got his hand out in front of him, and it was shaking so hard he could see it move. Mary! She ran. She crossed the room and climbed onto the bed and threw both arms around his neck, and his ribs screamed, and he did not care. He did not care about anything in the world. He got his arms around his daughter and pulled her against him and held her so hard she made a small noise. And he loosened his grip and then couldn't and held her again. She smelled like wood smoke and soap. She was warm. She was breathing. Daddy, she said again, into his neck. Daddy, Daddy, I'm here. His voice came out in pieces. I'm here, baby. I've got you. She started crying then, the hard, silent kind, her whole small body shaking with it. And he pressed his hand flat against her back and felt the bones of her shoulder blades and stared at the ceiling with his jaw locked and his eyes streaming. 2 years. 730 nights. He had counted them. Every hospital. Every park. Every poster. Every stranger's child in a red coat at the far end of a parking lot who made his heart stop. She had been alive the entire time. Somewhere behind him, Michael Rourke walked out onto the porch, quietly, and shut the door, and left them alone. James held his daughter until she stopped shaking. Then he held her longer. And underneath the joy, way down under it, something else was waking up. Something cold and steady and patient, with no bottom to it at all. Jean had known. Every time she cried on camera. Every time she said the word never. Every night, she slept 8 hours while he sat at the kitchen table. She had known exactly where their daughter was. James kissed the top of Mary's head and looked at the wall and did not blink. Mary fell asleep against his side about an hour later. One fist knotted in his shirt. She didn't let go even in sleep. James lay still so he wouldn't wake her. And when Michael came back in, James looked at him and said one word. Talk. Michael pulled the chair over. He sat down heavily and rubbed his palms on his knees. I've been looking for you for a year, he said. James stared at him. A year. Give or take. Michael, I didn't move to another country. I moved 4 hours. You moved and you changed your number, and you didn't tell one living soul where you went. Michael's voice stayed level. I went back to the house in April. There was a boy's bike in the driveway. New people. They gave me a name, and it wasn't yours. James closed his eyes. Jean had handled the sale. Jean had gotten the new phones. Jean had said no forwarding address because of the pity cards. I asked every neighbor on that street, Michael went on. Mrs. Aldridge thought you'd gone to Arizona. The man at the corner said Maine. I called your store, and a girl told me it was under new ownership, and hung up on me. I wrote to the police in Ashford and got a letter back thanking me for my concern. He said the last part with something close to disgust. I'm a gardener, James. I'm not the FBI. I had a truck and days off. Why? James's voice was low. Why were you looking at all? Michael looked at the floor for a while. Because I knew her story was wrong, he said. From the first day. And I let 3 weeks go by before I opened my mouth. And I'll carry that until they put me in the ground. Tell me. The day she disappeared. Michael lifted his head. I was there. The room went very quiet. The stove popped. You were on the schedule Tuesdays and Fridays, James said. That was a Thursday. I came back for a rake. I left it against the shed on Tuesday, and I needed it for a job across town. Michael's hands opened and closed. I pulled up on the side street about 4:15. I was going to cut through the side gate and be gone in 2 minutes. And your wife was putting Mary into a car. James did not move. Not your car, Michael said. A red sedan. Older. Mary had her backpack, the pink one with the cat on it. Jean was buckling her in the back seat and talking to her, and Mary was fine. She wasn't crying. She was asking about something. I heard her say the word ice cream. You spoke to Jean. She saw me. Came around the car quick. Michael's mouth went tight. She told me there was a family problem. Said her aunt was sick, and she had to take Mary out for a few days and she'd be back before you got home from work. She asked me not to bother you with it. Said you had enough on your plate. And you believed her. James. The old man looked at him steadily. She was your wife. She was standing in her own driveway with her own daughter, and she wasn't hiding. Yes, I believed her. I got my rake, and I left. James stared at the ceiling. What happened after that? She came back that night. Without her. And the next morning she called the police. The next morning she called the police, Michael said, and told them Mary vanished out of the backyard. Something in James's throat clicked. You knew. His voice was flat and terrible. You knew from day one that she left in a car with her mother, and you didn't say anything for 3 weeks. I said something. James turned his head. I said something to her. Michael's jaw worked. That was my mistake. I should have gone to the police, and instead I went to Jean because I still thought there was some innocent explanation, and I didn't want to be the man who put your wife in a room with a detective over an aunt in Rutland. He shook his head slowly. She told me I'd seen her taking Mary to a birthday party the week before. Different day. Different car. She said grief scrambles a man's memory, and she was so calm about it, so patient with me, that I walked out of that kitchen half believing I'd gotten my days mixed up. And then she fired you. 11 days later. James thought about the mail on the counter. It doesn't matter. I just don't want him around anymore. So you started looking. I had time. Michael's eyes came up. The car was the thing. A red sedan doesn't disappear. It took me 4 months to remember where I'd seen it. It belonged to a woman named Ruth Ellery, 81 years old. She used to come to the church my sister goes to, until her knees got bad. James waited. Ruth had a little girl living with her, Michael said. Told people it was a grandniece. Custody trouble with the parents. The mother came around now, and then with money. Nobody asked, because Ruth was Ruth, and she was good to that child. Fed her. Kept her warm. Read to her. Michael's voice went rough. That woman thought she was doing a kindness, James. She was told the mother was running from a dangerous man, and the child had to stay hidden for her own safety. She was told that man was you. James shut his eyes. When did you find her? 9 weeks ago. Michael sat back. I stood in Ruth Ellery's front room, and I looked at that little girl on the rug, and I knew her. And I got in my truck, and I put my head on the steering wheel, and I could not stop shaking because I had found her, and I still could not find you. Why not the police? I went. Michael said it fast, like it hurt. County sheriff. Sat there an hour and told him everything. What he had was a gardener with no proof, a missing persons case out of another state, an old woman with a child she said was family, and a mother who by every record was a victim. He rubbed his face. He said he'd look into it. Then Ruth had a stroke. The county took Mary into emergency care, and Jean got the call because Jean was still the mother of record. She was on her way to collect her. James's eyes opened. Collect her? That's right. To take her where? I don't know. Michael held his gaze. I don't think Ruth's house was ever going to be the last stop. I think it was a place to keep her while your wife figured out what came next. So, what did you do? I did the only thing I could think of. Michael almost smiled, and there was nothing happy in it. I took her. James looked at the sleeping child against his ribs. You took her. I've got a signed statement from Ruth Ellery's daughter, taken in a hospital room, saying the child was left there by a woman named James Mercer. I've got the sheriff's report with my statement in it, dated. I've got a receipt for a motel in Port Angeles with a 5-year-old girl on the registration. I did not run and I did not hide her. Michael leaned forward. I brought her here, to my brother's cabin, and I called that sheriff every single day, and I kept looking for her father. Because a piece of paper wasn't going to save her. You were. And the trail? That's the part one can't explain. Michael sat back, and his voice dropped. Ruth's daughter told me the mother had gone west on a trip. Washington, she said, somewhere near the water. It was nothing, James. It was a woman on painkillers repeating a phone call. But it was the first live thread I'd had in a year, and I've been walking those overlooks every afternoon for 6 days with a photograph of a man in my pocket. The rain filled up the silence. You were looking for me, James said. I was looking for you. On a mountain. In another state. I kept thinking, Michael said, and his voice finally broke. If I could just find James, I could finally tell him. James Mercer lay in a stranger's bed with his daughter's fist in his shirt and looked at a man he had let his wife fire over hedges. Michael, don't. Michael. He waited until the old man met his eyes. You gave me 2 years of my life back. I'm the reason you lost them. No. James said it like a door closing. You're not. And I want you to hear me say the name of the person who is. He waited until the next morning to ask her anything. The rain had stopped. Michael went out to check whether the road had opened, and James sat on the edge of the bed with his ribs strapped and his daughter cross-legged on the floor in front of the stove, drawing on the back of a seed catalog with a pencil Michael had sharpened with a pocket knife. He had rehearsed it 100 times in the dark and promised himself one thing. He would not interrogate his own child. Not once. That's a good house, he said. It's Miss Ruth's house. She kept drawing. It has 3 steps. Did you like it there? Mary thought about it, the way 5-year-olds think, with her whole face. She let me stir. Stir what? Soup. She looked up. She made soup on Sundays. It was orange. She let me hold the spoon, and she held my hand on the spoon. James smiled at her. Inside, something turned over hard. An old woman with bad knees had fed his daughter soup on Sundays for 2 years, believing she was hiding a child from a dangerous man. She sounds nice, he said. She fell down. Mary's pencil stopped. In the kitchen. She made a sound and she didn't get up, and I ran to the door and I couldn't reach the top part. Hey. He slid off the bed onto the floor, slow, and sat with his back against the frame, so he was down at her level. Hey. Look at me. She looked. You did exactly the right thing. I couldn't reach the lock. You went for help. That's the right thing. He tapped the paper. Miss Ruth is in the hospital and doctors are taking care of her. And that isn't because of anything you did or didn't do. Okay. Mary nodded slowly. He let it sit for a minute. He let her draw a chimney. Can I ask you about the day you went to Miss Ruth's? Her pencil went still again. He watched her small shoulders come up half an inch toward her ears. You don't have to answer, he said. You can say no. Nothing bad happens if you say no. Okay. Okay, you'll tell me, or okay, you understand? She almost laughed, which was the thing that nearly finished him. The second one. Fair enough. She drew a window, then another window. It was a red car, she said. It smelled like mommy spray. Mary wrinkled her nose. The one on the shelf. It made me sneeze in the back. James remembered the bottle. Square glass, gold cap, on the second shelf in the bathroom where a 3-year-old couldn't reach it, and reached it anyway. We drove far, Mary said. There was a house I didn't know. It was brown. There was a lady, and she had a blanket on her chair with birds on it, and she gave me soup. Was Mommy there? She left. The pencil pressed harder. She said she was coming back on the weekend. I asked how many sleeps. What did she say? She said 2. Mary shaded in the roof, back and forth, back and forth. Then it was more. James kept his voice as level as the floor. How many more? I stopped counting, she said, because I ran out of hands. He looked at the fire for a while. Baby, did Mommy ever say anything to you about me? Mary put the pencil down. She said it in exactly the voice she'd have used for a nursery rhyme, flat and memorized, the words of an adult in a 5-year-old's mouth. Don't tell Daddy where you are. The stove ticked. That's what she said? She said it every time on the phone. Mary picked at the corner of the paper. And she said if I told, then something bad would happen, and it would be my fault. So I didn't tell. Mary, I didn't tell anybody. Her chin started to go. Not even Miss Ruth. Miss Ruth asked one time who my daddy was, and I said I didn't have one. And that was a lie, and lying is bad, but Mommy said, Mary. He took both of her hands. They disappeared inside his. Listen to me very carefully, because this is the most important thing I am ever going to say to you. She looked up. 2 years, and her eyes were still the same. You were 3 years old, he said. Not one single part of this is your fault. Not the car. Not the lie. Not one day of it. Grown-ups made every choice, and you made none of them. Her mouth trembled. And you don't have to keep secrets anymore. He squeezed her hands. Not from me. Not ever. You can tell me the worst thing in the world, and I will still be sitting right here. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and put her forehead against his chest and stayed there. Outside, a truck came up the road. James sat on the floor of a borrowed cabin with his daughter's head against his sternum and made a decision that he would not move from for the rest of his life. He was never going to shout. He was never going to throw a chair or scream at Jean across a parking lot or give anyone a single video clip of an unstable man. He was going to be calm. He was going to be patient. And he was going to take everything from her, legally, permanently, in daylight, with her own words in his hand. Michael called it in from the general store at the bottom of the road. The first vehicle up was a county deputy who was 32 years old and had clearly never handled anything like it. He stood in the doorway with rain on his shoulders, looking from the injured man to the little girl to the old man with the thermos. Then he called his sergeant. By 4 in the afternoon, there were 4 vehicles in the clearing and a woman from the state taking notes on a tablet. They took James out on a stretcher because he couldn't walk the slope. He held Mary's hand as far as the ambulance and then had to let go, and she started screaming, and it was the worst sound he had ever heard. He made them stop the gurney. Look at me. He got her face in his hands. I'm going in a truck to see a doctor. You're going in a car with the lady in the green coat. We are going to the same building. I will see you tonight. Say it back. Mary was hiccuping. Same building. Same building. I have never lied to you, and I'm not starting today. At the hospital, they found 3 cracked ribs, a fractured left wrist, 22 stitches, and a concussion. A doctor told him a 60-foot fall through cedar was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to him. 2 detectives came at 7 that evening. James told them everything, in order with dates, from a folder he'd kept in a closet for 2 years and could recite from memory. Jean was picked up the next morning at the rental cabin. She had not reported her husband missing. That detail went into the file and stayed there. Her story came out fast and smooth. James had slipped. She had gone back to the cabin to call for help, and the landline was out, and there was no cell service, and she had been frantic. She said she'd driven to town twice. When they told her that her daughter had been found alive, she cried so convincingly that a deputy got her a cup of water. Then she said Michael Rourke had taken her child, that he'd been fixated on their family for years, that he had clearly manipulated her husband, who had a head injury and had been unstable since the disappearance. Then she said Mary's memories couldn't be trusted because the girl had been away from her real parents for 2 years and had been coached. It was a good performance. It just had holes, and the holes were the shape of questions she couldn't answer. She couldn't explain why an 81-year-old woman 2 counties over had been raising her daughter. She couldn't explain why that woman's daughter had signed a statement naming James Mercer as the person who left the child there. She couldn't explain why a man she'd fired had seen her put Mary into a red car on the afternoon she told the police the girl vanished from the backyard. And she could not explain, not in any version she tried, why in 2 years of interviews, vigils, television cameras, and church services, she had never once mentioned Ruth Ellery's name to a single police officer. Child Protective Services opened a case that week. The caseworker's name was Maribel Dawson. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up in her hair and a canvas bag full of folders, and she had a way of sitting down that made her room slower. She did not interview Mary in an office. She sat on the floor of a family room with a bin of plastic animals and let Mary sort them by color for 11 minutes before she asked a single question. She did not ask leading questions. Everything was recorded. James watched 40 minutes of it later, at the request of the investigators, in a small room with a detective beside him. He watched his daughter line up 3 plastic horses. He heard Maribel Dawson ask, gently, whether anyone had ever asked Mary to keep a secret. And he watched his 5-year-old look up at a stranger and say, in that same flat, rehearsed voice, "Mommy said Daddy couldn't know where I was." The detective reached over and paused the recording. "You need a minute?" "No," James said. He was looking at the frozen frame. His hands were folded on the table, perfectly still. "Play it again." That one sentence, from that child in that room, with no adult in the frame prompting her, became one of the load-bearing walls of the entire case. 3 weeks later, a judge granted James emergency temporary custody, and he carried his daughter out of a courthouse in Washington state and put her in the back seat of a rental car, and drove her across the country to a rented house in Vermont that neither of them had ever seen before because he was never setting foot in the old one again. James filed for divorce 11 days after they got home. Jean fought it before the ink was dry. Her attorney was a polished man out of Boston with a soft voice and hard eyes. His first filing did not deny anything. It reframed everything. It said James Mercer was a mother who had made a catastrophic error in judgment during a mental health crisis brought on by an abusive marriage. It said she had placed her daughter with a family friend for the child's safety and had been too ashamed to correct the record afterward. It said the fall was an accident during an argument her husband started. It said James Mercer had a serious head injury, a documented history of obsessive behavior around the case, and had been isolated for 2 days in a remote cabin by a man with a fixation on the family. It requested joint legal and physical custody. James read it twice at his kitchen table at 1 in the morning and then went outside and stood in his own driveway in the cold until he could feel his hands again. His attorney was a man named Nolan Pierce, 56, rumpled, an office over a dry cleaner in Montpelier, and a reputation that did not match either of those things. He read the same filing in about 4 minutes, put it down, and took his glasses off. "Okay," he said. "First thing, you're angry." "Yes." "Good. Anger's fine. Anger is fuel." Pierce leaned back. "But from this morning forward, nobody outside this room ever sees it. Not the judge. Not the guardian ad litem. Not a deputy. Not a waitress. Nobody. They accused me of abusing her. They did. They put it in a court document. They did that too." Pierce tapped the pages. "James, look at what this actually is. This isn't a defense. It's bait. Every line in here is written to get a reaction out of you. If you stand up in a hallway and raise your voice one time, they will have their unstable man, and everything her lawyer just wrote becomes true in front of a judge." James sat with that. "So what do I do?" "Nothing loud." Pierce leaned forward, and his voice changed. "Don't try to destroy her. Let her explain herself. She's a liar with a 2-year head start, and she's very good at it. She's been good at it in a house, with one audience, with no record. Now put her in a system that writes everything down. Depositions, sworn statements, discovery, a CPS caseworker with a recorder. Every version she gives has to match every other version she's already given, forever, under oath. And it won't. It never does." Pierce spread his hands. "Liars can't hold still. All you have to do is stop giving her something to react to and stand back and let her fill the record." So that's what James did. He stopped answering her. Every message went unread and forwarded. Jean texted him 47 times in the first month, and he read none of them and deleted none of them, and every single one went to Nolan Pierce inside the hour with a timestamp. She started warm. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been sick. She said she wanted to explain in person, alone, no lawyers, just them like it used to be. Then she got frightened. She said he was letting a stranger poison their daughter against her. She said Michael Rourke was dangerous and James was too naive to see it. Then she got angry. One message read, "You always needed to be the good one. Even now. James looked at that one for a while and felt nothing at all, which surprised him. Something in him had gone quiet on the floor of that cabin, and it had stayed quiet. He wrote back once in his life, through the lawyers, in 12 words. All communication regarding our daughter will go through counsel from this point forward. She never got another word out of him. And exactly as Nolan Pierce had promised, with nobody left to argue with, Jean Mercer began to explain herself. In her deposition in January, she said Ruth Ellery was an old family friend she'd known for years. In a written response in February, she said a woman at a support group had introduced them and she barely knew her. In her deposition, she said she'd left Mary there for 2 nights. In a letter to the Guardian ad litem, she said the arrangement had always been meant to last months. In one interview, she said she'd told the police about Ruth. In another, she said she hadn't, because she was terrified of losing her daughter. Pierce kept a chart. It was a single sheet of paper with 2 columns, and by the end of February it needed a second page. "She's building the rope," he said one afternoon, sliding it across the desk. "We're just holding the end of it." The thing that broke it open was a cardboard box in a storage unit in Ashford. Jean had rented it during the move and never emptied it. It came up in discovery because James remembered the monthly charge on an old bank statement, $41 a month for 2 years. One line item he'd never asked about because asking questions had a cost. Investigators executed a warrant on a Tuesday in March. Under a comforter and a box of picture frames was a shoebox holding 3 old phones and 2 chargers. One of the phones had been Jean's before Mary disappeared. Dead battery. Screen cracked in a corner. It took the state lab 6 days. Nolan Pierce called James at his shop on a Thursday morning and said one sentence. "Come to the office. Now." The printouts were laid out on the conference table in order. James stood and read them standing up and did not sit down once. There were dozens of messages with a man named Henry. He had never met a Henry. He had never heard the name in his house. Later he would learn that Henry was a regional sales manager Jean had met at a conference in Albany, that it had gone on for 14 months, and that he had a wife and 2 teenage sons in Connecticut. 10 days before Mary disappeared, Henry had written, "What are you going to do about the little girl?" And Jean had answered, "She doesn't understand what she saw. I'll handle it." James read it 4 times. "What she saw," he said. "We think Mary walked in on something," Pierce said quietly. "At the house or in a car." 3-year-olds narrate. "She probably told her mother, in front of her mother, exactly what she'd seen and who she was going to tell." James put his palm flat on the table. Then he read the next one, and the room went out of focus at the edges. It was sent at 9:14 on the night Mary was taken away. Roughly 5 hours after Michael Rourke saw a red sedan pull out of the driveway. Roughly 11 hours before Jean Mercer called the police in tears. "Henry, is she safe? Jean, nobody is going to find her." 5 words. James stood over that page for a long time. Behind him, Pierce didn't say anything, and that was the correct decision. Nobody is going to find her. He thought about the copy shop owner who stopped charging him, about the tape gun and the frozen light poles, about spelling his daughter's name for a hospital clerk in Albany who was kind to him for 4 minutes, about walking a riverbank in March with a flashlight because a caller said maybe. He thought about Jean standing at a podium in a church, holding a photograph against her chest, saying she would never stop looking. "It doesn't prove she meant to hurt Mary," Pierce said carefully. "A defense attorney will argue she was protecting the girl from a violent situation and panicked. It doesn't have to prove that. No, it proves she knew." James's voice was completely even. "It proves that at 9 o'clock that night she knew where my daughter was, and it proves that at 8 o'clock the next morning she picked up a phone and lied to the police, and it proves she kept lying for 730 days while she watched me lose my mind in front of her." He straightened up. "Everything else is decoration." Pierce nodded slowly. "Then that's the case." The messages went to the criminal investigators the same day, and to the family court, and to Maribel Dawson. There was no more argument about whether Jean Mercer had known. There was only the question of what else she'd done. The Washington investigators had never closed the file on the fall. At the beginning, Jean's version had been simple and consistent, which is what makes a version believable. James slipped on wet trail. She reached for him. He went over. The evidence never quite fit it. The trauma team's report noted that the bruising pattern across his upper chest was consistent with force applied by 2 flat palms, and inconsistent with a backward slip on a downslope. The trail surface at the overlook was packed dry stone that afternoon, on the only rain-free day of that week. A woman from Oregon who'd been hiking with her sister remembered passing a couple arguing near the second overlook. She remembered because the man had stepped off the path to let them by and said thank you, and the woman with him hadn't looked up. And in the search of Gene's devices, investigators found that 8 days before the trip, on a laptop in a Vermont living room, someone had looked up the trail. Not the lodge, not the restaurants, not the hot springs, which was what everyone searched. The specific trail, the elevation profile, and a hiking forum thread about unfenced sections above the lake. They brought her in for a third interview in April. James wasn't there. He read the transcript later, all 30 pages of it, at his own kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He could hear her voice in every line. First, she was certain. She had never touched him. She had been 4 feet away when he slipped. Then she was helpful. Well, she may have made contact, because she lunged forward to grab his jacket when he lost his footing, and possibly her hands hit his chest in the attempt. Then she was wounded. She couldn't believe they were treating a grieving woman this way. Then, on page 22, she was fogged. I don't remember exactly. It happened so fast. You're asking me to reconstruct 2 seconds from 6 months ago, and I've been under enormous stress. Each version contradicted the one before it. All of them were on tape. And on page 26, an investigator asked her, mildly, why she hadn't called for help from the family on the trail 400 feet behind her. There was a 9-second pause in the transcript. Someone had noted the length. Then Gene said, I didn't know they were there, which was a problem because James had stepped off the path to let them by, and she had been standing beside him when he did it. Gene Mercer was arrested on a Tuesday morning in May in the parking lot of a pharmacy in Ashford, quietly with no cameras. James found out by phone. He was at the shop at the counter with an invoice in his hand. He said thank you to the detective. He hung up. He finished the invoice. Then he went out back and stood by the loading door for 4 minutes and let himself feel it all the way down, because he'd earned that. Then he came back inside and asked the kid on register whether the delivery had come. The woman who had spent years steering every conversation, every explanation, every version of the truth in his own house, was now in a room she couldn't leave, in a story she no longer got to write. The custody hearing was in June. Jean came in on a bail order, in a gray cardigan and no jewelry. She had let her hair go a little. She'd lost weight. She looked exactly like a woman who had been through something terrible, and James understood, sitting there, that this was the last performance and she had rehearsed it. She cried in the first 2 minutes. She told the court she loved her daughter more than her own life. She said she had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, the worst mistakes a mother could make, and that she had made them while drowning. She said she had been failed by everyone around her. She said she wasn't asking to be forgiven. She was only asking not to be erased. It was good. Some of it was even true, which is what made it good. James sat with his hands folded and did not react to a single word. Not when she said his name. Not when she said, through tears, that he had always been the better parent. Not when her attorney called a child's bond with her mother a biological fact no court should sever. Nolan Pierce had told him once that when the other side is drowning, you don't jump in to hold them under, because then you're both in the water and the judge only sees splashing. So James listened. Then the record spoke for him. Maribel Dawson took the stand for 2 hours and never raised her voice once. She read from her own notes. She played 4 minutes of a recording from a family room floor. Mommy said Daddy couldn't know where I was. She described a 5-year-old who hid food under her pillow for her first 3 weeks in her father's home. A child who woke twice a night and walked to her father's doorway to check that he was still there, then went back to bed without waking him. A child who, asked to draw her family, drew a house with 3 steps. She testified that after the second supervised visit, in which Jean told her daughter that Mary was the only one who could bring her mother home, the child had regressed for 9 days. She called that conversation an attempt to make a 5-year-old responsible for an adult's legal outcome. Then she gave her recommendation. Mary Mercer needed stability, continuity of counseling, a full school year in one place, and time to rebuild a relationship with her father that had been severed by an adult's deliberate act. And given the circumstances of her removal, the 2-year concealment, and the documented attempts to influence her, CPS recommended that Jean Mercer have no unsupervised contact with her daughter. Jean's attorney fought it for another hour. He fought well. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a pen she never once put down, listened to all of it. She granted James Mercer sole legal and physical custody. She ordered any future contact to be supervised, therapeutic, and subject to the recommendation of the child's treatment team. She noted for the record that no such contact would be considered while criminal proceedings were pending. James did not smile. He didn't turn around. He put his hand flat on the table for a second, and that was all. Behind him, he heard Jean say his name once, out loud in the room. He didn't turn around for that either. In the corridor afterward, the afternoon light came through the tall windows in long stripes across the marble, and Mary was sitting on a bench next to Maribel Dawson, swinging her feet, holding a juice box with both hands. She saw him and slid off the bench. She came across the corridor at a run and hit his legs, and he picked her up even though his ribs still complained about it, and she put her arms around his neck. "Are we going home?" she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." The criminal case took another 11 months. James learned more about the law in that year than he'd ever wanted to know. He learned that the things that hurt most are not always the things that carry a sentence. Her affair wasn't a crime. Nobody goes to prison for a 14-month relationship with a sales manager from Connecticut. Her lies to him weren't a crime either. There is no statute for letting a man search parks in the rain for 2 years. What was a crime was what she did with her hands on a trail above Lake Crescent, and what she did with a 3-year-old in a red sedan, and what she did every time she gave a sworn statement that contradicted the last one. She was convicted on the charges the evidence supported, including the attack on him. She received a prison sentence measured in years, not months. James was in the room when it was read. He had expected to feel something enormous. He felt instead a kind of flat correctness, the way a bone feels when it's finally set. Jean did not look at him. She looked at the table. The rest came apart on its own. Henry never testified for her. His name came out in the coverage, and his wife filed within a month. He did not write to Jean. He did not visit. 14 months and a shared secret about a child, and the man simply stopped existing. Jean's family went quiet in stages. Her mother came to the first 3 days of the trial, and not the fourth. Her sister, who had organized the search grid in Ashford, stopped taking her calls in the spring. The people who had praised Jean Mercer for 2 years as the strongest mother they had ever seen read the messages in the newspaper like everybody else. "She doesn't understand what she saw. I'll handle it. Nobody is going to find her." But none of that was the punishment. James understood the real one on a Wednesday in September, when he was standing in a school parking lot at 3:15, watching a line of 6-year-olds come out of the double doors with backpacks bigger than they were. Mary came out third. She was talking to another girl. She was laughing about something with her mouth open and her front tooth missing. She looked up, found his car, and her whole face changed, and she started running. That was the sentence. Not the prison. Not the newspapers. Jean Mercer had traded that every afternoon for the rest of her life. She had taken a child away from a man to protect a secret, and in the end she had lost the child, the secret, the man, the affair, the house, the reputation, and the entire version of herself that she had spent 2 years selling to everyone she met. James opened the passenger door. Mary climbed in and immediately started telling him about a caterpillar. He never once told his daughter that her mother's life had fallen apart. He didn't need her to know. She was 6. He never moved back into the house on Ridgeline Road, and he never went to look at it, not once, not even a drive-by. Instead, they bought a small place outside Burlington, with a porch on the west side and a maple in a yard that turned an unreasonable orange every October. 2 bedrooms. A crooked kitchen drawer he fixed, and that broke again. A yard with no gate. Mary started school. She was slow to speak for the first term, and then in the spring, she wasn't. Her teacher said at the parent conference that Mary had an unusual ability to notice when another child was upset. James smiled and said that was nice, then sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes afterward. She had counseling every other Thursday with a woman named Dr. Elena Frost, who kept a bowl of smooth stones on her table and let Mary hold one during the hard parts. She learned to ride a bicycle in the church lot down the road. It took 4 Saturdays, and on the 4th one she got 60 feet on her own, looked back to see if he'd seen it, and immediately hit a curb. Slowly, the checking stopped. The doorway visits at 2 in the morning got further apart, then stopped. She stopped asking, in the small, careful voice, whether he was going to be there when she woke up. 2 years after the courthouse, on an evening in early autumn, they were sitting on the porch. The air had that first bite in it. Mary was on the floorboards with a tin of colored pencils, working on something with great seriousness, her tongue between her teeth. "Daddy." "Yeah." She didn't look up. "Mommy isn't coming back, is she?" James let a moment go by. He had promised himself he'd never lie to her, and he'd also promised himself she'd never hear one word of adult ugliness from his mouth. Some nights those two promises fit together badly. "Not right now," he said. Mary picked out a green pencil. "Put it back." Took the brown one. "Did she hurt you?" He looked at his daughter. 7 years old. Long legs now. Scab on one knee. His mother's mouth. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a while. The pencil moved. "On purpose?" "Yes." She nodded, slowly, the way children do when they're filing something away for later, for when they're bigger and can carry it. He didn't tell her about the trail. He didn't tell her about the messages, or the deposition, or the 9-second pause, or the fact that her mother had answered a question about her safety with 5 words that James would hear in his own head for the rest of his life. She was 7. She didn't need the adult details. She would want them one day, and when that day came he would answer every single question honestly, and not one day sooner. She only needed one thing tonight, and he made sure she got it. "Mary, look at me." She looked up. "None of it was your fault," he said. "Not one piece. Not the car, not the secret, not the 2 years. That was your mother's choice and mine to fix, and you were 3 years old." Mary held his eyes for a second longer than a child usually does. "Okay," she said. Then she went back to drawing. James sat back in the chair and listened to the wind come through the maple and let his coffee go cold, and did not feel one single thing that resembled forgiveness. The letter came in November. He knew what it was before he read the return address, because of the handwriting. 22 years of grocery lists and birthday cards. He carried it inside, set it on the counter, and opened it standing up, for pages front and back, and it was very good. She apologized, not the sideways kind. She wrote the words, "I did this." She said she had made choices out of fear and vanity, that she thought about the backyard every day, and that she was in a program inside, learning things about herself she should have learned at 25. She said she thought about the trail, and that there wasn't an hour she didn't. And then on the 3rd page, it turned the way it always turned. She said Mary would be growing up with a hole in her, and that only a mother could fill it. She said the child would resent him one day for keeping them apart. She said the counselors inside had told her that reunification was healthiest for the child. She said she wasn't asking for herself. She asked him to bring Mary to visit. She asked for another chance. James read the whole thing once, all the way through, standing at his kitchen counter in a quiet house at 10 at night with his daughter asleep upstairs. Then he put it down. He thought about what it would cost, on paper, to say yes. A drive. A visiting room. 2 hours. Some people would call it grace. Then he thought about a child who had hidden food under a pillow. About 9 days of regression after a woman told a 5-year-old she was the only one who could bring her mother home. About a small voice reciting a sentence somebody had drilled into her. There it was. Even in 4 pages of apology, the same move. Make the child responsible. Make the child the reason. James folded the letter along its own creases and put it back in the envelope. He took it upstairs and put it in the bottom of the folder in his closet, the one he'd kept for 2 years, with the case numbers and the flyer. He didn't burn it. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't write back. Not that week, not that year, not ever. He didn't do it to make her suffer. Her suffering wasn't a project of his. He'd stopped being interested in her at all somewhere around a cracked phone screen in a state lab. He did it because his daughter slept 8 hours a night now. Because she rode a bicycle. Because she had a friend named Priya and a favorite pencil and a school play in December. Because peace had taken that child 4 years to build, and it was hers, and he was not going to hand it back to the person who took it the first time. He never forgave her. He never once considered it. Not as a burden, not as a temptation, not as a thing he was supposed to grow into. Forgiveness is a door, and some doors you close because there's a child on your side of it. On a Saturday morning in the spring, James was on a ladder against the side of the house, replacing a section of gutter that had been complaining all winter. Michael Rourke was below him, 63 now, and still refusing to let anyone else hold a ladder. He came up twice a year and would not take money. He put in the raised beds the first spring and came back every year to argue about tomatoes. Mary called him Mr. Michael for 1 week, and then just Michael, and he pretended that bothered him. "You've got it crooked," Michael said. "I do not. Left side's low. You want to come up here? I want you to look at the left side." James looked. The left side was low. Behind them, the back door banged. "Daddy." He came down the ladder. Mary was running across the grass in socks, which she was not supposed to do, holding a sheet of paper over her head like a flag. She was 9. She'd gotten tall over the winter, all elbows, hair pulled back in the way she'd started doing herself in the mornings. She stopped in front of him and held it out with both hands. It was a drawing, not a 5-year-old's drawing anymore. There was perspective in it, and a real sky. There was a house, with a porch and a maple. There was a girl in the yard, and there was a man beside her, taller, and their hands were joined. "That's us," she said. James looked at it for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's us." She grinned, and then she hugged him around the middle, quick and hard. And then she was already turning to go show Michael, because Michael was the only adult she'd ever met who took drawing seriously. James stood in his own yard with the sun on the back of his neck. For 2 years, he had searched for his daughter and found nothing. For one of those years, a man with a dented truck had searched for both of them, and had found her and could not find him, because Jean had moved them out of the city, cut every phone line, and buried every thread that led back to the life they used to have. And then he had gone over the edge of a cliff, pushed by his own wife, and landed in the one stand of cedar on the one mountain in the one place on earth where that man was walking every afternoon with a photograph in his pocket. He had lost his marriage. He had lost 2 years of his daughter's childhood that no court could give back. He had nearly lost his life on a warm afternoon above a beautiful lake. But he had not lost her, and that was the one thing Jean had never been able to take. He never forgave her. He never needed to. The truth had already given him something better than revenge. It had given him his daughter back. And this time, nobody was taking her,